Welcome. You can see over my shoulders that fall is definitely in the air. Although we had a brief glimpse of winter, early September, where we had our first snowfall and we were frantically covering plants as well as harvesting from our urban homestead. But weather has returned back to normal, and you can see those lovely hints of red, purple, and orange showing up, and we are still continuing to harvest out of our backyard. Here we are on the west side of our house, looking at or I should say, one of our tomato gardens. And you can see we still have tons of green tomatoes. These were covered earlier in the month when we had that freak snowstorm, and they are still producing quite well. I will say that over there's a spaghetti squash, even covered, that took a bit of a hit from that snow and frost. But looky there, still tons of green tomatoes, and we are continuing to harvest out of this bed. We have only covered just that once, but later at the end of the month is when we can start getting more frosts and freezes beginning to happen. But for the time being, we're going to keep our garden going as long as possible. Another sign that fall is in the air, we have begun raking. Our trees are beginning to drop some of their leaves, and what we do not throw those away. We actually use those in our garden. So I have begun to mulch some of our beds. Any extra I'll put into our compost piles, but this is one way that we help naturally add nutrients to our soil. One of the plants that does really well in our climate are collard greens. I mean, look at this guy. We don't apply any non-organic material. It's all organic and natural in our backyard. So I have put down some worm compost tea throughout the season. Now, we have had a few bugs here and there, but I view that as a small price to pay for gardening organically. But we have been using collard greens, and over here in the same bed I even have a few more tomatoes. They aren't trellised. I ran out of stands to put them on, but they are still producing. And I don't know if you can see way down there's actually a few little tomatoes that are continuing to ripen. So this little garden bed, and truly a garden bed, because looky here, there's a headboard. This is an old vintage bed frame that I got years ago, but it just adds a little whimsy to our garden space. Here we are looking at our clove currant, and you can see that it is taking on its beautiful burgundy bronze colors. This is a shrub that we had harvested from earlier in this year, and I used its berries. Let's see here if we can spot. Oh, there's a lone berry right there that we had missed. But we use the berries in jams and jellies as well as eating fresh, because this type of currant does not have an astringent or musky flavor to it. So this is something we really enjoy having on our homestead. And here we're looking at just one of my kale plants that is thriving in my straw bale garden. And if we kind of pan down a little bit, you can see the straw bales. It is continuing to do well in our climate. Actually, this is a pretty cold, hardy plant, but I did cover our entire straw bale garden when we had that freak snowstorm earlier in the month, but everything is still looking really good. And even over here, I got another little kale plant in that is doing quite well. Oh, and see there, that's one of my favorite cherry tomato varieties. That is black cherry. So folks, if you haven't tried that, that is definitely worth looking into. They are very sweet. They have a very intense, let's get a little closer here. They have a very intense tomato flavor. They are quite delicious. I discovered this variety about 10 years ago, and they have always been part of my garden ever since. One thing that I haven't shown you throughout this garden series are my sage plants. And folks, I planted this our first year that we put in this particular garden bed. And notice beside that, I have 2 sage plants. And folks, for the record, they are about 2.5 feet tall and easily 4 feet wide. And they just produce like crazy. And granted, they're up against the south side of our brick house, and they absolutely love it there. I harvest like crazy off of that, and I will dehydrate my sage. I use most of it dehydrated, and I put that into a lot of our fall soups and stews. And what would be a dressing without having sage in it? And I even crumble some up and put it on roasted vegetables. But I mean, just look at those beauties. I will never ever have to plant another sage plant. And again, these guys have been going strong for years. What you are looking at here is one of the main things that I love about gardening, and that is growing tomatoes. We do heritage varieties, otherwise known as heirloom varieties, and this has just been a plant that has produced so well. This is Amish paste, and look, it is just loaded with tomatoes. And again, this is one of the reasons that when we do have an early frost or freeze predicted, I will go ahead and cover, because I'm not willing to give up the bounty yet of this particular tomato variety, because there's jars of sauce that are just waiting to be made from this one particular plant. What you're looking at here are our celery plants. I have 3 extremely healthy plants this year, and I have been harvesting off of that. Sadly, I don't have the tag that says what variety it is, but this is a nice stalk celery with huge leaves, and so I consider that actually this is giving me 2 crops, because one, we harvest the stalks to eat fresh, and I'll dehydrate some, but I also really enjoy harvesting and dehydrating the leaves, because then I use those in soups and stews during the fall and winter months. And if you've never grown your own celery, believe me, you're in for a treat, because the flavor is so much more pronounced compared to store-bought varieties. Here I wanted to show you our vegetable trug. And even though we covered this when we had our snowstorm, the cucumbers just did not survive. They did not do well. So I'm actually at a point now where I'm going to go ahead and pull those up. And if you can see a little closer here, the raccoons have actually been in the bed and they've begun to dig. Although they left my chard alone, which is really, really nice, because we're continuing to harvest from that. But this is just a good example to show you just how tender cucumbers really are. They really, really do not like cool weather at all, or at least not in our region. And again, northern Colorado, zone 5B. Here's something fun I wanted to share. Again, it's not vegetable or herb related, but this year I bought some of these purple Delphiniums just to put up around the outside of our chicken run. And let me tell you, these guys have just been blooming like crazy. They've responded very well to pruning, so whenever a bloom stalk is reaching past its prime, I go ahead, cut back, and a few weeks later, I have more blooms that are beginning to set like this. So I will still have blooms at least for a few more weeks or until we get our next heavy freeze. So that's a great idea. Plus the pollinators love, love, love these delphiniums. And here I am over in front of our raspberry bed. Our raspberries are definitely the fall producing. We do not get any berries midsummer. It's usually not until September that we begin to see berries set. And while I do enjoy making pies and jams with our berries, I have to admit that we almost always just eat them fresh. And for us, then it's a race to see who can get to them first, whether it is us or the squirrels or the raccoons. And yes, even in an urban setting, we really have raccoons to contend with here, because in the night they can come through and raid our garden and just decimate a lot of our plant materials. So that's an ongoing battle for us. But just wanted to show you, and again, we'll get a little closer here, but look at those berries. So we'll be harvesting yet some more this evening, just to go along with our dinner tonight. But again, these raspberries do extremely well in our northern Colorado zone 5B climate. One thing I'd like to share about our backyard that hasn't been a success is that on this obelisk I am growing jelly melon for the first time. And if we get close, you can see there are still blossoms. In fact, there's quite a few blossoms. But you know what? Those are the only blossoms we have had this year. And I planted early spring, but this plant just did not do well in our zone 5B climate here in northern Colorado. While there are a lot of little tiny jelly melons that are set, there is no way that they are going to mature before we get our first really, really hard freeze of the season. I will cover one more time, but I doubt that I'll get any jelly melons off of this plant. Again, this is not veggie or herb or even fruit related, but wanted to show you something that continues to thrive in our yard with minimal care on our part. And that right here, these are Chinese lanterns. I have them planted on the west side of our backyard, and they are growing underneath our wild plums. So if we scroll up here, you can see here's our wild plums. So it's not a real dense shade, but a light filtered shade. And they are doing extremely well. This is a wonderful perennial. And what I'll be doing this weekend is cutting back some of the stems. I'll take the leaves off of them, and then I'll bundle them together and let them dry. I'll hang them upside down, so one, they'll dry straight. But what's really cool is that the lanterns themselves will maintain this really bright and vivid orange color and makes a great addition into fall themed decor. While this is not vegetable garden related, one thing we did this month was to add a little more spark to our backyard. And so I managed to acquire these flagstone and bricks for free. And then I had Mr. Overalls lay those underneath my favorite bench So one, this will be not only a very attractive place to sit, but it also reduces the amount of mowing and our maintenance in our yard. I had also found the farmer's market sign, which I just thought added a nice touch of whimsy. And then I added one of my repurposed projects. Over here on the end is a black wrought iron plant stand with a plant saucer and then stones from our backyard. And I have turned that into a combination bee and bird water in our backyard. That was a real easy item to put together, and it helps bring wildlife to our backyard. And one last thing I'd like to share with you from our backyard homestead is this plant right here. This is our Korean maple, and it has the best fall color of any of the plant material in our backyard. It's great for an urban homestead because it only gets about 12 to 15 feet tall. This particular variety is multi-stemmed, meaning there's more than one trunk. But just look at the foliage. We have it turning a very deep scarlet red. There's burgundy, there's yellow, and there's even some orange leaves on here. So it really puts on quite the display. So with that said, folks, I hope you enjoyed our September garden tour.